Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar From Protest to Policy, a call to action for EU decision makers on Georgia. This is an important and timely discussion on the challenges facing civil society and independent media in Georgia, especially in light of the recently adopted law on transparency on foreign influence. This legislation mandates that civil society organizations receiving over 20% of their funding from abroad register as foreign agents. In the next 60 minutes, our expert panel will explore recent developments, including the pushback on democratic norms and the impact of Russian interference. We'll also consider concrete policy recommendations for the EU and international community to uphold democratic values in Georgia. My name is Anne Helge, and I'm the coordinator of the Swedish Civil Society Network for the Eastern Partnership at Forum CIV. This webinar is organized in collaboration between the network members, Civil Rights Defenders, Green Forum, Forum CIV, and RFSU. Now, let me introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Moreta Bobokhidze, Program Officer at Civil Rights Defenders. Moreta is an election observer, a woman human rights defender, and an activist. Moreta, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining for the webinar. Thank you, experts, for taking your time. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Despite the circumstances in Georgia, we are still on fighting mood, all of us in Georgia. I'm representing, as Anne already said, the civil rights defenders in Georgia. We are working for democratic reforms, focusing on supporting civil society organizations, grassroots organizations who are working on women's rights, LGBTI rights, and media rights in Georgia. Yesterday, as you all know, the law on foreign agents, or transparency as they call it this year, was adopted. And I'm underlining this year because, as you might remember, last year we had similar initiative from the opposition party, but after the protests of the civil society groups and the large population, it was withdrawn. Actually, that time, head of the government promised that they never ever bring this law back, but as we saw, they brought it back and they have adopted it despite of the long-standing, actually 2 months protests. So here we are today, and this is the fact, but of course the fight goes on, and there's election upcoming in October, the parliamentary elections. So there's still floor for the victory. Today, I would like to give the floor to the activists and professionals who were involved in the protests and also observing and monitoring the situation. Therefore, I would like to give the floor to Malkhaz. Malkhaz Rekhaviashvili, who is editor-in-chief of Factcheck Georgia. Prior to this, he worked as a TV show host for the Georgian public broadcaster Agera TV, seeking to defend its electoral independence as an elected chairperson of the Alternative Trade Union of Journalists. He also founded the Regional Bureau of Governance Monitoring Center. Malkhaz, thank you very much for joining us, and please, floor is yours to give us your observations for the situation. Thank you.
I forgot to unmute. First of all, thank you for inviting me and for the introduction. First of all, maybe the parliament had passed a law yesterday, and they did not take into account or consideration the veto of the president of Georgia, but we still, the civil society of Georgia and media professionals, think that the process is not finished yet. We will continue to defend the civil society integrity of Georgia, and we will try to go to the elections, defend the choice of Georgian people and European aspirations of Georgian people. And so I'm not I'm not in a bad mood actually, because during the last 2 months we managed to win versus ruling party's propaganda, in spite of Georgian Dream trying for 55 consecutive days um, to make people believe that this law is only about transparency. The Georgian society, Georgian people, for these 2 months were standing in the streets protesting, and they only in any normal democratic countries, these protests would have been absolutely enough for the parliament and ruling party to withdraw the law. But we are not living in a normal country. We are living in a country where the ruling party is trying to consolidate authoritarianism and to change the path of the country from more or less democratic country to the backyard of Russian Federation. So in previous years, Georgian civil society was working and Georgian media was working to broaden the democracy. Now we are in a different mode. We are now in a mode where we need to stop the authoritarianism. So last year, you already mentioned that last year was a similar law introduced by the ruling party, but after the protests, they withdrew. But I just want to point your attention to the fact that during the last year's protests, Georgian Dream used governmental resources to create coordinated and inauthentic behavior in the social networks, to make a fake discussion in the social networks, to change the perceptions of Georgian people, and they used governmental resources, public resources, to organize so-called trolls and bots in social media. This year, they paid even more attention to this. So they made even huger efforts to around the clock. I'm just quoting Meta's report. It's not my views or my points of views. It's everything in the report of Meta in 2023 quarterly report, which was published in May, and you can just read it. Around the clock, they were working to discredit the protesters. They used for these governmental resources, and the strategic communication department of the government of Georgia was linked to the coordinated and inauthentic behavior network, which was deleted by Meta. So we are living in a situation where the ruling party is trying to blur everything, to lie, and I, as a fact checker, it became even harder to work in this situation. So in spite of everything we see that Georgian people, 80% still supports Georgia's European integration, and Georgian people, huge majority, is protesting 55 days without stop. So what do we have to do now? We need to continue the protests in the streets. We need to continue so-called strategic lawsuits, and I see representative of Jakeli here, so she will, of course, speak more about this. We have to continue strategic lawsuits against this law. We have to continue to talk with people around us to make sure that they go and vote in October of 2024. In order to save this country from fully stopping its European integration, because we, after the yesterday's voting in Parliament, we saw a very sad comments from European politicians about Georgia's European path stopping after this law. For example, Carl Bildt, who is a co-chairman of European Council, it's tragic, but it's true. And yeah, I of course agree. By passing this law, Georgia is further from European integrations than it has ever been. But we need to change the reality before the election. So this was just an introduction. If there will be questions about what Georgian civil society plans in the future, or what is or any other questions, I will be here to answer.
Thank you very much, Malkhaz. And last question to you, as I will have it to all the speakers. What would be your recommendation to EU policymakers? What should be done by them as a Georgian and as a media representative? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer this question now?
Yeah.
I think European policymakers shall continue, and I see that they are continuing. Shall continue the support of Georgian people and Georgian people's choice. I think Georgian people showed unprecedented dedication to European and North Atlantic aspiration and integration. We Georgian people are in the streets since the war in Ukraine started. But let's talk only in the context of this law. For last 55 days, Georgian people are in the streets protesting and defending European values. So Georgian people now need to see that the enemies of European values are going to be punished for hijacking Georgia's future. And European policy makers shall take into consideration our will, and I think that steps made by European policymakers shall be about the ruling party, not about the people. So I would like European policymakers, while they are thinking about how to what to do, what steps to do in the future, I want them to think not to punish Georgian people, but to punish those responsible for hijacking our future. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Malkhaz. Thank you very much. And I would like to welcome our second speaker, Tamar Oniani, who represents Georgian Young Lawyers Association, one of the largest, oldest, and prominent NGO in Georgia. Tamar, thank you for taking your time. Tamar is program director at GAILA. Prior to this, she led the GAILA's international litigation team. She's also a lecturer in international human rights and public international law at several Georgian higher education institutions. Tamar, please, if you can share with us your observation of the situation and how the legal proceedings went over the arrests and treatment to the people who were demonstrating and protesting, and also if you could give us one recommendation or more for EU policy makers. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Moreta. I think it's very important times in Georgia, not only from Georgia's local perspective, but at larger scale, because what is happening now, it's not only the local issue, it very much is about the change of the country's foreign policy, which affects all. I will speak about from a human rights perspective, because when we are saying that this law targets all, I think it's very true, because it's not only about civil society organizations or only about media. It's about freedom, and the adoption of this law yesterday, it serves to be just a death penalty for freedom. But the history shows us that Georgians, they actually do not agree on will continue. And what happened after the reinitiation of this law in these 60 days, we have witnessed the unprecedented violation of human rights. And I want to speak about from about this from 5 major standpoints. First, this is the physical integrity of citizens. Second, this is the freedom of manifestation. Third, this is the freedom of expression. Fourth, this is the liberty and security of our citizens. And last, I want to also speak about these repression tactics and the practices that the civil society organizations and the ordinary citizens face just because of having the dissenting opinions. We have witnessed that during these 60 days after the reinitiation of this law on the 3rd of April, different human rights and liberties have been harshly violated. For example, physical integrity of citizens is always at stake, not only from the law enforcers' side, but also human beings are facing the violation of physical integrity from the third persons. These are called so-called titushki raids, what was the widespread practice in Ukraine, but we also see some evidences of this happening in Georgia. From the law enforcers' perspective, I think it was most harsh and most vividly witnessed how the police conducted violence against demonstrators. We have always heard about the ill treatment after the detention, but now we see this on the footages. Now we see this very vividly, very openly. Even the policemen without masks are involving violence against demonstrators, just the ordinary citizens, which is of course very harsh practice, which of course demands the procedural guarantees to be fulfilled from the Special Investigative Service, which is the special agency in Georgia that was created to address such kind of violations, the serious human rights violations that are conducted by the law enforcement officers. However, we unfortunately do not see any kind of tangible results from the Special Investigative Service. Of course, the investigation, it's a long-going process. However, we want to see from them that they at least qualify the crimes in a correct manner. For example, when we see the ill treatment that has special criteria under human rights law, this should not be qualified as exceeding force by the law enforcement officers, which is the wrong qualification, and numerous international organizations are telling us about this problem. And I think that the Special Investigative Service now should have a leading role in addressing such kind of violations, because this impunity, of course, creates a threat for future violations of human rights. Second, we have witnessed that all the demonstrations that took place almost every day since the April 3rd, most of the demonstrations, when the Minister of Interior Affairs dispersed the rally, first, this was unlawful, and second, the tools that we are engaged, they were not proportionate. And when we assess this, of course, we base our assessments on the objective evidence. And we see that, for example, the dispersal of the rally often started without any legal ground. Even though when there may be like local incidents, this big human rights picture shows us that just for ordinary incidents, the state is not allowed to disperse the whole rally. About the means used, these special means, they were used in parallel, which is also a violation of the law. They were used without prior warning, or they were not given the adequate time to leave the territory for the demonstrations. And for me as human rights lawyer, gravest practice in this was when we have witnessed how police conducted violence, the physical violence against demonstrators, and how all the exits were closed by the special task force. This practice, we have not witnessed this for years, for more than years. However, since we have seen this during these demonstrations, it actually raises a big threat that the police, the special task force, has become harsher and they violate these rights more openly. Third, I also want to speak about from media perspective, because during the demonstrations, not only the demonstrators were assaulted, but also media representatives. And media is the one that is the source for bigger society, because despite the protest is ongoing in the regions of Georgia as well, biggest protests, of course, happen in the capital. So the people in the region should know what is happening in Tbilisi. And when media is targeted during the demonstrations, of course, this is a clear threat to freedom of expression, but also media was targeted through the parliamentarian accreditation rules when they were not given the reasonable access to air the events in the parliament. Last year, the parliament adopted special accreditation rules for media, which is instrumentalized to restrict the critical media coverage in the parliament. Fourth practice that I want to speak about is about liberty and security, and I want to speak about this in twofold direction. First, this is massive administrative detention practice during the demonstrations, because demonstrations are not only dispersed through the active special means, but the administrative offenses code that was adopted in Soviet Union time in Georgia, which is still in force and which actually leaves people without the guarantees of fair trial. This code is very much instrumentalized during the demonstrations, and people are being detained mostly without an illegal ground. Then they are taken to the isolators, and then they are taken to the court. The court hearings only last, in some cases, in most of the cases, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. In this scenario, of course, it would be illusion to have this expectation that the fair trial for the person is entertained and is ensured. And then they are fined, the demonstrators are fined for thousands of laris, which of course, taking into account the economic situation and the average salary in Georgia, is a very high fine. And this is also an instrument to silence dissenting voices in Georgia. The new practice regarding these demonstrations is criminal liability. So some demonstrators, we are also arrested on the basis of criminal cases built against them. We are actively monitoring these cases at the court and observing how they will develop, and hope that this criminal threshold will not be attained just because of the fact that people were on a demonstration and blocking the, for example, the road, which is also form of freedom of expression and the freedom of manifestation. And just not to take much time, last but not least, my colleagues will add a lot of details on the environment. What is happening here is this active chain of repressions. Because alongside with demonstrations, alongside with the media coverage and our activism, we have received a large-scale repression wave against civil society representatives, against some of the political party members, against just ordinary civic activists or the people who just attended the demonstration. And what was the major tools for this repression? It was the phone calls that we are allegedly done through the call centers. It's also part of these Titushki raids that we have witnessed. And people were receiving like tens of calls during a week, and also their family members. I myself and my family members have received such calls. saying that these calls aimed at threatening, intimidating, to have then impact on the freedom of expression. And these calls also were released late at night, which of course is another aggravating factor. How that they failed, and this actually did not threaten the free voices in Georgia. And there was also numerous evidence of repressions for people who are employed in the public sector. This is briefly about the human rights environment that we have on ground. And maybe just to address Moreta's question, what would be the call for European stakeholders? I think before elections, the monitoring of the human rights environment in Georgia will be crucial to have this situational analysis and to know what is going on here, because for human rights and democracy, this law on foreign agents, the transparency of the foreign influence, it's not, of course, the sole instrument. It's a whole playbook. It's a secret surveillance. It's illegal detentions. It's a bloody dispersal of the rally. So all these should be seen as a whole, and I think it will be very important from local stakeholders to actively monitor. And we at Gaila, we will fulfill also our watchdog function. We will provide free legal aid to the detainees. However, it's also important to have international stakeholders involved in this work and to keep eye on Georgia. Thank you.
For your insightful information and for the recommendation as well. Now I want to give the floor to Tamar Jakeli, who represents Tbilisi Pride. She's actually the director of Tbilisi Pride and also Georgian green and queer activist. Tamar, if you could please share your observations, also the feelings, how it was for queer activists to be involved in these situations, and also give us a recommendation for EU policymakers. Thanks a lot. And you have 5 minutes, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to speak fast. Thank you so much. So us Georgian queer activists are fighting not just one law, but actually 2 laws that have been initiated in the past months. There is also this constitutional anti-LGBT bill on the table that fortunately the government does not have the constitutional majority for. So that will be discussed basically later, like that will come in reality later if the Georgian dream stays in power, but we have to do everything so that they don't, and not just because of the foreign agent law, but because of also the anti-LGBT constitutional bills that are really homophobic and hateful and just targeting the lives of queer people in Georgia. So about the foreign agent law, pretty much the second time when it was reinitiated, we were actually quite certain that the government would try to pass it, and that's what happened. So it was really not a big surprise for me yesterday, unfortunately. And despite the large-scale protests that would have been enough for any democratic country, basically the Georgian government has shown itself to be truly anti-democratic and pro-Russian. And I also share the belief that we have to, and we will re-elect, we will basically vote against them and elect a better government in October. And we have to do everything in our power so that we can do that. So I think that the protest energy has to really be reshaped into pre-election energy, and the people who stood on the streets should be the defenders of every vote, and should be campaigners, in every village, in every city, should basically explain to the people that Georgian dream cannot stay in power any longer, and if they do, this would be basically end of Georgia as we know it. Every segment of the society has been involved. Students have been on strike. We have seen largest largest collaboration of every segment of society to really make the voices heard. So I think the participation of such large segments of society really showcases that the people are quite fed up with the Georgian dream, and that people will vote for a pro-Western democratic forces in October. And what the EU should do, I think the EU should really target sanctions towards the individuals who are responsible for the democratic backsliding in Georgia. Georgian people should not be punished because we have been on the streets every time when the country needed us to, and we will continue to be on the streets. The people who are responsible for Georgia's anti-democratic path, these are actually in the minority of the society. So actually, like, for the first time as a queer person, I have felt that I'm not in a minority of the society, but I'm actually in a majority, because now the society that is being born in front of our eyes, the sort of like new civil society, nobody really like cares about anything that makes us different from each other, but we are all concentrated on what unites us, and what unites us is the hope that Georgia can be a democratic European-style country, and that together we will stand to make it happen. And I think that basically, even though the government really tries to kill civil society in Georgia, every time that they will attack the NGOs and the media and the formal civil society, people will rise up on the streets, and this will be basically a new civil society that will be born in this process. So I'm actually quite hopeful about our prospects. I think that we are closest we have ever been to defeating this government, and definitely now most people share this belief that it's not about the law anymore, but it's about the government. Yeah, we will do everything in our power for the next 5 months to make it happen. Also, like, a lot of people have been fined. We have up until 1 million lari in fines that we have to collect, and some people have been imprisoned for really absurd charges. And yeah, these are basically cases that we have to show solidarity to the people who have been imprisoned, who have been fined, who have been physically injured. It would be great if the EU policymakers also make it clear that these people are political prisoners, and that these people should be remembered and not forgotten. Yeah, I think that basically we are now as united as we have ever been, and as strong as we have ever been. And yeah, we just need the West to keep supporting us in every statement, through every means. Personal sanctions would be great. I know it's not so easy from the EU to have these sanctions, but like, everything that can be done, I think, should be done to target the individuals who have been responsible for this anti-democratic path, but not the people. And I believe that at the end of October, we will celebrate Georgian people's victory, and that we'll be able to start the negotiations with the EU quite soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you for your fight and contribution in all this happening in Georgia. Indeed, brave and appreciated a lot. Now I want to give the floor to our last Georgian speaker, Tamta Mikeladze, who is the co-founder of Social Justice Center, and as the director of Equality Policy Program. Her main focus areas include religious freedom, religious and politics, the inclusion and rights of non-dominant ethnic groups, peace politics and human rights protection in conflict regions, and women's and LGBTI rights. Please, Tamar, floor is yours, and you're welcome to share your insights as well as recommendation for EU policymakers. And you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Moreta. It's honored to be part of this process and a discussion. Thank you to my colleagues for a very important intervention. So yes, unfortunately, Georgia is facing very tough times now, and the recent legislative initiatives coming from the Georgian government shows how the democracy in our country is weakening and how the foreign policy is changing. Especially after the after a full-scale war in Ukraine, Georgia is witnessing a dramatic turn in its politics. On the one hand, it's obvious that the current government has changed the course of its foreign policy from a normative foreign policy, which means that in this situation, policy is based on integration and values in European structures, to a pragmatic multi-vector policy. Against this background, we see aggressive rhetoric against the EU institution, our partners, decisions and legislative initiatives that openly and demonstratively contradict EU's values and standards. And at the same time, the government is softening its relationship with Russia, no longer consider them, seeing them as a threat, increasing trade with Russia and increasing waves of tourists from Russia. At the same time, it's worth to note that government started strategic political and economic cooperation with China. So all these dramatic changes within the foreign policy was made without any institutionalization of the process, without any consultation with opposition, with the CSOs, and without the proper processes. And regularly we have the feeling that the government has some informal communication and cooperation with Russia, with China, and for us it's even difficult to properly identify all layers and the scale of such a cooperation and the compromises they are making. On the other hand, it's fact that there has been a political reversal in the country, and from a hybrid democracy, the country has moved rapidly in 2 years to a hybrid competitive authoritarianism, and it's also adopting the type of legislative acts that exists in consolidated, solid authoritarian systems. So in this reality, the Tamar mentioned how repressive is the response from the side of the government. 100 our citizens become administratively arrested, and their amount about million lari of fines against the protestants. There are several very problematic criminal cases. We can say that a lot of rallies were brutally dispersed, and during these rallies, police used inadequate and unproportional force. We see the well-organized campaign against the activist civil society representatives, and this repression is also very visible for us. And unfortunately, the GD government decided not to normalize the situation, and their response to the existing crisis is not political. So the response we see on the side of the government, it's the repression, it's the police, but not the political instruments and the ways to overcome the political crisis. So that's why in our society we have the feeling that yes, today, on the other hand, we have the Ukrainian people's hard fighting to protect their independence, liberty, dignity. And meanwhile, in Georgia, we see how the Georgian people is organizing and fighting against the hybrid war of Russia, which is conducted here through our own government. So Really, we see that a lot of people are outside. It's the students, professors, teachers, doctors, theaters, and we are actively opposing these negative political changes in our country. So I mentioned like these bigger shifts in foreign policy and domestic policy, but together with the so-called Russian law on transparency of foreign influence and anti-LGBTI constitutional law, draft law, which was also mentioned by Tamar, and we can say that this draft law restricts very basic LGBTI, very basic private and family rights for civil and political rights for LGBTI people, but also censors the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly and gender education in the country. So this law is not only about the LGBTI people, but it's about also the other people who are not sharing heteronormative perspectives, who are teaching the gender theories, and who are supporting the idea of sexuality education, etc. Also, we would like to mention that several months ago, GD government cancelled mandatory gender quotas in the parliament and city councils, and it's very clear how misogynic and sexist language they are using against the women politicians. And also, I would like to mention the changes in the tax code, which makes easy to move profit assets tax-free between Georgian and offshore zones. And we see these changes as a very important instrument for Mtsvaneebi and other loyal businesses to him to freely move their assets, their capital, their profits without restriction, without monitoring. And of course, we have fears that this mechanism will be used by the Russian business group as well. So in this reality, we have the only one institutional democratic chance to overcome the crisis, and it's the election. Of course, we see very strong asymmetry between the power the GD government has and the opposition has. For example, there are several very important numbers which may be interesting for our partners. 700,000 people, they are dependent on social assistance, the monthly social assistance coming from the state. We have 300,000 public service employees, and it means that about 1 million people are under the regular dependency on the state. They are getting their salaries or some social assistance from the state. So GD government is trying to instrumentalize social vulnerability, poverty, economic inequality we have in the country. Also, they have consolidated the power, institutional power. All institutions, including constitutional courts, they are under the control of GD government. We can say that even the Orthodox Church is now under the control of the government, and we have never had so weakened church when they cannot represent independent agenda and the positions regarding the political crisis. But on the other hand, we see the thousands of the people outside, which is very well organized, very creative, very solidar, very supportive to each other. Now we see that opposition is starting to coordinate, and the role of Salome Zurabilishvili in this coordination is very, very high. And you know that she submitted this Georgian charter as an idea, as a strategy how to overcome this political crisis. And of course, we have the very good infrastructure of civil society organizations and medias. So these three factors and very important support from the outside, like our partners, will give us. So all these factors are giving us chances to have the really democratic, so really important elections, and to have finally multi-party coalition government and the parliament. So this is briefly about our reality, and I think that it's very important if international partners will continue their support to Georgia. I'm talking about the political support. I mean about the support of civil society organizations, different movement, collectives, initiative groups. And now it's very important for donor organizations to have more flexible, decentralized funding schemes. Also it's very important to have some support for political opposition to strengthen their networks with the EU institutions and EU countries, to give them some important advices, and also to monitor ongoing developments in Georgia, because as I mentioned already, these economic and security issues are invisible under our control. Government is not even providing public information about the ongoing processes. So this observation from the specific institutions from the EU or EU country members is also very important, to know everything about this informal and invisible relationship with Russia. So even this issue of information, access to the information, is also vital for us and for our struggle.
Thank you, Tamta, very much for discussing the issues from broader perspective. That was very insightful. Thanks a lot, and thank you for our giving the recommendation too. Now I'm giving the floor to our Swedish speakers, and Hugo von Essen, who is the analyst at Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, and previously worked as an intern for the Department for Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please, floor is yours, and you're welcome to share your insights as well as recommendations for EU policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Moreta. I just have one idea. Maybe it's better to let Elias speak first, so that we make sure that everyone has the time. And I think my comments follow better on his inputs. Just a suggestion.
It's a good suggestion. Although I was kind of keeping Elias as a final.
Okay. In that case, I will make my. I will be quick in that case. I realize we don't have.
Please go ahead.
We don't have too much time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to make a few quick points. First, I think EU policy has failed. I think we need to talk about that. EU policy has been too geopolitical. It has been too much realpolitik, too little driven by EU values, too unrealistic. The EU has been scared of pushing GD into the arms of Russia. And I think, I know this is a bit provocative. I think a lot of people here disagree with me, but I think the EU, or the recent developments show that the EU should not have given candidate status to Georgia. The EU did give it to Georgia, not because it wanted to reward the Georgian population, as I hear a lot of Georgians say, but I would say out of fear that otherwise the GD would go all out anti-EU, all out pro-Russian. So candidate status was given, and then despite this, the GD anyways went all out anti-European and pro-Russian. So I would say this was a clear failure. The EU has also been very unclear in its messaging, too ambiguous, not willing to assign blame on the GD, on Ivanishvili. We can see this in the statements by Borrell. The latest statements now also it's very weak, very soft, and I think this also builds on the fact that the EU has been naive about GD, thinking that the GD can be constructive, but we should talk about the GD now more and more as a regime pursuing a multi-vector foreign policy similar to Central Asian countries, and this is a regime that will never take Georgia closer to the EU. Then I also think we should talk about the Georgian opposition. that the opposition must get its act together and use this force now, this political will, the protests, channel it into political results, and the opposition has a big responsibility here. And as a foreign observer of Georgia, a lot of the time I get tired of hearing about all these polling results. About 80% or 85% of Georgians are pro-EU. Do those results really matter if the people still support GD? If the people don't vote in the elections the way they should, do those polling results matter? And then my third point is about Georgia in the larger geopolitical context, because a lot of the time in these types of discussions, we discuss Georgia and we tend to forget about the rest of the world, and we only see the Georgian internal domestic situation as if it's in a vacuum, and we put our blindfolds on and only focus on Georgia. But first, we should see Georgia in the regional context. We should talk about the risk here, I think, about the EU growing too tired of Georgia, of losing sight of Georgia, and instead putting hope on other countries. I mean, of course, a lot of EU attention is on Ukraine, but now also more and more on Armenia. And I think a lot of EU policymakers, unfortunately, right now think that the clearest democratic pro-EU hopeful light in and hope in the South Caucasus region now is not Georgia, but Armenia for the first time. And of course, Armenia depends on Georgia, and if Georgia falls to Russia's grasp again, then Armenia is much more likely to follow, of course. But there's a risk here that the EU will slowly start to give up on Georgia. Georgia will slowly be forgotten if there is no perception of hope in Georgia. And here, I think, is where Georgia's opposition, civil society, and population has a responsibility to show that they can turn around this development, including through the election. And then we should also see the law in the context of similar laws. If we look at the greater context, not only the regional, but the global context, similar laws being adopted across the Eurasian continent in other countries with regime ties to Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Slovakia, Hungary. Azerbaijan claimed that the law was not Russia-inspired, but Azerbaijan-inspired, which was very weird. But this is the empire fighting back. This is the Russian Empire fighting back against the West's attempt to stop Russia and to isolate Russia. And we should understand Georgia in this context, and that what happens across the rest of the Eurasian continent in the greater battle between the autocratic East and the democratic West affects Georgia. We also see, of course, increasing ties between Georgia and China. This is also part of this development, I would say. And the better that the West fares in its battle against Russia and China globally, the bigger chances small countries like Georgia has. And the better that we can stop anti-EU and pro-Russian forces in small countries like Georgia, the stronger our ability to counter and deter Russia and China on the global stage. So just quickly on the question about EU policy going forward. First, clear messaging. Unlike the recent statements by Borrell, assign the clear blame, no more ambiguity about Ivanishvili, about the GD, and so on. 2, less carrots, more sticks. We've already talked about sanctions here, but we should also talk about the threat of the removal of the visa liberalization regime, and so on. Shift all economic support from government agencies and so on to only civil society initiatives. 3, put more pressure on the Georgian opposition to actually capitalize, mobilize all this political will expressed in the protests, and 4, formulate a Georgia policy that is part of a greater policy against Russia, against China, against global autocracy, and so on. Which, of course, I mean, all of this requires EU unity, which we don't have for any of this, I think, which makes it unlikely. We have countries like Hungary and others blocking. So the question is then, can we instead have coalitions of the willing within the EU and with other Western partners to try to implement some of this policy going forward? So that's my final point. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, so much. You brought up the points that is the subject for another webinar, and we should think about it. Thanks a lot. And final floor I would give to Elias Norin, desk officer for Georgia, Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to his role, Elias worked as a news reporter for major daily newspapers and holds bachelor's degree in political science from Uppsala University. Please, floor is yours, Elias, and we are really listening to you very carefully. Share with us your observations as well as recommendations and Swedish government's policy towards Georgia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Moreta. Obviously, I'm going to be quick here, but maybe we'll run a bit over time. Obviously, we are very concerned. Sweden is very concerned about what we see, not only the adoption of the law yesterday, but also the broader picture of the events surrounding the law, but also other laws initiated previously. And we are also disappointed that we are having this discussion yet again, because as previous speakers have said, we had the same discussions with the Georgian counterparts last year when the law was up on the table. From a governmental point of view, and from a point of view from an EU member state representative, this law is, as said many times before by ministers and EU representatives, the law is incompatible with the EU norms and values, and this actually takes Georgia further away from its stated goal of joining the Union and for closer integration with the EU and NATO. As a previous speaker said, that demonstrations it should be enough for our government to rethink this law. I would also add the many statements and many calls from Georgia's friends. Sweden is a long-standing partner and long-standing friend of Georgia, which we have said to our counterparts. For instance, when Minister Johan Forssell was in Tbilisi in the beginning of May, he met with the Georgian representatives, and this was one of the messages he conveyed, that Georgia and Sweden has been friends for a long time. Sweden has supported Georgia for over decades, and this support has amounted to over 3 billion Swedish kronor, which amounts to approximately 1 billion Georgian lari. And this support has also gone to not only civil society organizations, but a large part of it has also gone directly to state authorities. So Sweden has invested a lot of money and time and political capital on this relation. And with this law adopted, these relations are bound to have consequences, both in terms of the EU-Georgia relations. This law, as it runs counter to Georgia's EU ambitions, it also contradicts Georgia's at least 3 out of the 9 steps that Georgia was given by the Commission when it was granted candidate status in December last year. It contradicts at least 3 of those. So EU support and Swedish support is it's dependent on the recipient and the partner to also to make progress on reforms and to stick with their EU path. So this is going to have consequences for the relations, and without preceding the discussion on exactly what those consequences are going to be, I can say that on Monday 2 days ago, the foreign ministers discussed Georgia at a Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels, and the ministers will also discuss Georgia in June, on June 24th, and there will be a longer discussion on Georgia. This time, the discussion was a short one, but a lot of countries were engaged and were very involved in the discussion. But on June 24th, there will be a full discussion point at the Foreign Affairs Council, and it is expected that options regarding actions will be discussed more in detail on that meeting. And without preceding the discussion, all options are on the table, and we look forward to having that important discussion. And there will also be a discussion among EU leaders also in June among the heads of governments. So Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and all other heads of governments will discuss Georgia as a discussion point as well. And this is for a smaller country like Georgia, this is quite a big thing, because it's a big event and it has large consequences for EU's policy towards Georgia. And I also want to make the point that Sweden will continue to support the Georgian civil society, the Georgian independent media. We actually increased our support in the beginning of May by approximately 10 million Swedish crowns. And this is a sign of Swedish policy also going forth. If this law will be implemented, is that we have to see what we can do about our support. Sweden is the third largest bilateral donor to Georgia, and we are very proud partners to the civil society and to many partner organizations within Georgia. We will continue to support them in this difficult period of time, and we will see what we can do about our support, if we are going to recalibrate it or what the final decision will be. But again, this is a very disturbing time, but it is also important, as previous speakers have said, to continue voice their to continue protesting and continue voicing their concerns about the law, which also the Venice Commission has been very clear about. So it's both domestic concern, international concerns, but also legal and human rights concerns. So I think that's important to note as well. I'm going to stop there, but if there is any questions, I'm happy to ask, or happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias. Thank you very much. And indeed, we are grateful for Sweden's support to Georgia. Actually, the projects that are focusing on gender equality always are funded by Sweden, which is much appreciated, as well as advancement of LGBTI rights and media rights. So we're thankful for Sweden for its continuous assistance to Georgia. Thank you for all speakers. I think we have managed to organize really insightful, full of honest and critics and also recommendations discussion. Thank you all for that. And I would like just to summarize some recommendations for EU policymakers that were outlined by Georgian speakers and also the Swedish analyst Hugo, to be clear for punishment and sanctions, and to sanction those who are authors and implementers of these types of laws, and not to punish the public, which is essential, since This will make Georgian civil society really disappointed and maybe just vanish the results that we have reached, which is consolidation and unity. Second recommendation from Tamar Gaila was to keep the eye on Georgia and help the civil society organizations to monitor human rights situation in the country. And the other one mentioned by Tamar and Tamta was to support to continue supporting CSOs and be flexibility in funding and decentralized in funding, so that the grassroots and other NGOs can continue their crucial work in the country. And I remember from Hugo very much that we should we shouldn't look not only on Georgia, but look at Georgia in a regional context, which is very important. And I very much agree on that. I guess I didn't miss anything except want to summarize our discussion with the words that Malkhaz highlighted, that we are not any longer advancing democracy, but trying to stop authoritarian regime, which is our reality. But we also should remember that democratic backslide is a kind of trend in all over, and we have to be careful, cautious, and really dedicated to fight for democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Thank you very much. I wish you strength and implementation of democratic recommendations in our countries. Thank you.